Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we were going to get into the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, but we decided to do something different. So we really wanted to get into this listener email that we received, and this comes from listener Tammy, and she said she lost her 21-year-old son in a motorcycle accident, and she's still going through the 5 stages of grief, which is what we talked about in the episode titled Grief. And she said the denial stage happens even after the loss. I often say out loud, please come home, Kyle. It feels like he's just off at school. The bargaining stage also happens after the loss. Yes, it's irrational, but I would pray all the time for God to bring him back. Losing a child is a life-changing experience. And even after 5 years, I still have each of these stages, even with counseling. And we talked about this before in our last episode, that the loss of a child is got to be one of the hardest things to deal with. And you can't really measure someone's grief because it's so individualistic. But losing a child certainly has to be one of the hardest types of grief to overcome.
Well, I think that's true. And I agree, it's really hard to measure grief, or to say my grief is more profound than yours. But I think the biggest problem with the death of a child is it tips everything upside down, all our expectations. I think that, we really think that our children will outlive us. I mean, we believe that, and
Right.
That's what normally works. And so when our children do not outlive us and they die before us, it is such a hard thing to get over because it changes all our expectations. And so I understand how the grief can be so profound for Tammy. I also think that what we talked about in our previous episode on grief is that it's not linear. You don't go through one stage and then the next and then the next, but you're cycling through these different stages of grief. And, 5 years is certainly a long time, so I understand her concern. And it seems to me that, she's done a good thing by going to counseling. Often that's not going to be enough. And, maybe later on in this podcast, we can talk about some other things that she might be able to do. But I think that death of a child is always going to be so very, very difficult for a parent.
Right. And, as parents ourselves, Mark, we can sympathize with her, but I don't know that we can ever truly empathize with her because it's just not something you can understand unless you go through it. I mean, we can certainly do our best to understand and put ourselves in her emotional space, but we can never truly understand and comprehend what she's going through.
Right. And that's true, but that's not really what empathy is. Empathy
Okay.
is the ability to put yourself in that other person's emotional space. So you don't need to experience what another person has experienced in order to have empathy for them. And you and I are in different stages of life. So my fear of a child dying, it's not really my children anymore. It's like, what would happen if my grandchildren
Right.
my grandchildren died. So it's still something that I don't think about it often, but I just think how difficult it would be to get over that. And so, yeah, we're different life stages. But I can have empathy for her because I think it would be such a terrible thing. I imagine myself in that situation, either with an adult child or a grandchild, and I cannot imagine how I'd get through that. I really don't.
Oh, yeah. I mean, at age 21, that's young. And I think what can make that grief hard is it's the loss of potential.
Yes.
There's so many things that Kyle's missed out on and all these experiences that Tammy isn't going to get to have with her son. And that's hard. And it's hard to cope with dealing with that loss of expectation, right?
It is. And so I think parents of young children, you're in these different stages of life, and so you're intimately involved in their daily lives. And so that death of a young child is hard because it changes every aspect of your daily family life, and it leaves this
Mm-hmm.
huge emptiness. But then if you have an older child or an adolescent, that's difficult because you can see them becoming the person that they will be, which is
Yeah.
what, as a young child, you don't see that, and later adolescence, you start to see it and all the potential, and even seeing them become independent. And so you lose that. But even as an adult child, then your relationship has matured. You're still parent and child, but you're on more of, I think you're more friendly. And I use the word peer, but that's not a good word to use, because I don't know that as parents we're ever peers with our children.
Yeah.
But certainly with my adult children, I have a very different relationship with them. I'm not the one telling them what to do. They're
Yep.
in charge of their own life. And so, it certainly is more friendly. And so death of a child at any age, I think, would be very, very difficult.
Right. And the other thing to consider too is the fact that it was a sudden death, because
Yeah,
this happened in a motorcycle accident. And that can make the denial stage feel a lot harder to get through,
right.
because as opposed to if your child gets a terminal illness, and not that it changes the loss or the grief, I mean, you're still going to grieve for that child, but in that instance you have time to come to terms with it, more than as just in an instant your son is gone and you never got to say goodbye. And that can make closure very, very difficult, is not having that last moment, and really savoring, this was my last moment with my son, and I was able to have this really tender interaction with him, and we were able to say how much we loved each other and all these things. You don't get that. It's just whatever happened to be your last interaction, that was it. And we can often take that for granted.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point, because you're right. The death of a child, say to a disease or cancer, is certainly very, very difficult. But I think you have more time to come to terms with that. And it's a slower process, which can be difficult in its own way as well. But I think you're right. The sudden deaths, I think sudden deaths even of older
Yeah.
people that we know can be very, very difficult as well, because you don't have that time to plan for it. So I think that, the death of a child, it's the loss of those hopes and dreams that
Hmm.
you have for a child, the potential that I think we all think about with our children, and that potential that will never be realized. I think in our minds, we think, at least I did, I always thought about my children getting married, having children of their own, me being a grandparent. And so you lose that with that child. You don't have any of those. And so in our mind and in our culture, we always, we can see ahead to what life might be like in 20 years
Hmm.
with our child, and perhaps their children, and that's not going to happen. So the grief, I think the sadness will always be with us and with Tammy. What we don't know, I think, about this in the email is we don't know how it affects her daily functioning. And I don't know
Hmm.
if in the email you pick up on that at all.
I didn't. I think she's been through therapy, and it sounds like she just still, or at least what I'm guessing here. It sounds to me like she just still is going through these. I mean, because grief comes in waves, and sometimes
Mhm.
it just hits her. And I expect that it will for the rest of her life.
Yeah,
And in a way, from my own perspective, I don't think I would ever want to stop feeling that grief, because, I mean, yes, the grief is hard and it hurts, but it's a way of remembering them. And,
right.
you don't ever want to forget them.
Let's just talk about some common reactions to grief for people who may not have heard the previous podcast on grief. There can be intense shock, confusion, disbelief, denial.
Hmm.
Tammy talks about denial, and that's even true if the death was expected. What it seems like in the email is she has this overwhelming sadness and despair, and which I can certainly understand. What we don't know is if that makes daily tasks or even getting out of bed difficult or impossible. And I'm sure that was probably true at early on, and hopefully
Hmm.
that's not true now. You can have intense anger, feelings. We don't know the context of the motorcycle accident. Was it an accident that just happened with him? Was there someone else involved? And so
Yeah.
the context of that could be important as far as it relates to her anger. Sometimes we feel guilt or feeling like we failed somehow as our child's protector. So I think those are pretty common reactions to grief. And so certainly counseling is one of the things that we can do to help process it. I think there are other things you can do on your own. I think writing about your child. I'm a real believer in writing or journaling. I think can be really important. And the reason I think it works is because often these thoughts are just swirling in our head, in our mind. And if you get them out and put them down on paper, in a way it's symbolic. It's like, okay, I'm taking them out of my head and I'm going to put them down. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think writing about it, whatever it is, writing, if you're angry today, write about your anger. If you're sad today, write about your sadness. If you're missing your child today, well, write about the things that you miss. And I think sometimes, I think a mistake a lot of people make in going through grief is they try to push it away.
Yes.
And they try to ignore it. And honestly, you can't ignore it. And I think what happens is just it gets stuck inside of us. Those emotions are still there, whether we express them or not. And so, the things I'm suggesting as far as writing or even talking to others about the child that you've lost, that's a lot about expressing what's inside you and getting it out.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be really helpful to write those things down for a lot of people because it gets it out. And it doesn't mean it's not important or that you aren't thinking about it. It's just you're trying to get it out of your mind. And
Mm-hmm.
that I think I wonder if that's what she's struggling with, is that it's almost constantly in her mind and in her head.
And as human beings, we don't like painful and uncomfortable emotions in general. And we tend to
That's
shy
true.
away and we want to push them away. It's our natural instinct because it's unpleasant and we don't like it. And so I think acknowledging them, first of all, that can be an incredibly powerful feeling to just acknowledge this is what I am feeling right now. And then, second, just sit with the emotions for a little bit. It
Mhm.
doesn't make you a weak person, or it doesn't mean that it's bad or it's negative in any way. You're just acknowledging, and you're just allowing yourself to feel. Let yourself feel. Just sit in the pain and it'll pass. You're not going to stay in that state forever, but it's going to be helpful to just sit and try to work through those emotions.
Right. And hopefully there's someone that you can share this with as
Yes.
well. And, often that is a therapist. It doesn't have to be a therapist, certainly. It's just someone that you can talk to who will listen and will have that empathy for you and that understanding. So
Hmm.
sharing, I think, is important. I think is a huge mistake to hold it in.
Yes. So Tammy also goes on to ask a question, and she was going through a divorce at the time that her son passed, and so it was postponed for a while. And then she goes on to say, after losing our son, after the divorce, a lot of my friends and family walked out of my life because they couldn't deal with me grieving and dealing with the divorce. How do I handle and not get bitter towards those people and also begin trusting other people in my life because I am afraid they will also walk away? So this really adds to it. I mean, because we talked about this in our episode on grief, that a divorce, that's a type of loss.
Yeah.
And you can certainly grieve over a divorce. That is very, very much a type of grief. And so she's got these two major life changes happening at the same time. And that's going to create, I mean, grief that you can't imagine that unless you're in literally her head, right?
So, it's really sad to me that people around her, and I think she mentioned friends and family,
Yes.
who weren't there, who I guess, don't talk to her anymore because of the grief, probably a lot because of the divorce as well. But that
Mhm.
is so sad that other people couldn't be there for her. And I think what happens, especially with grief, is a lot of people don't know what to say.
Yeah.
They don't know how to respond to the person who's grieving. And so rather than be uncomfortable in not knowing what to do, they just retreat and they go
Mhm.
away. And I've certainly seen that. The other thing is they'll be there and they'll say really inappropriate things, which always happens, with people who are grieving. There are going to be some people who will be inappropriate. But she asked really important questions that how do you then trust others? And
Mm-hmm.
that's often the case with betrayal. And I would, in this case, use that word betrayal
Yeah.
because I think, especially with family members, I think part of what we do as family and even as friends is we're there for each other. And
Yes.
so there was a bit of betrayal, and she's wondering how then does she start to trust people again, which is very, very difficult once you've been betrayed because it's also a natural inclination for us to be really protective
Yeah.
around our emotions, and we tend to build a wall. And so I think, the incredible pain that she felt. And it sounds to me like she went through this a lot on her own.
Mm-hmm.
I can imagine that she's built some pretty strong walls around and she's probably wondering how do you take those walls down or how do you start to let people in? Because trust is something that's not given. You have to build trust, and trust is
Yeah.
built over time with positive interactions and positive behavior. And so the only way I know how to do this is she's going to need to get to a point where she can be vulnerable just a little bit, not a lot vulnerable, but a little bit by starting to let people in. And I think that the more you can do that, then over time the trust grows. Now, this is difficult because of the divorce as well,
Mm-hmm.
because we don't know any of the context of the divorce, but there's probably trust broken there as
Right.
well, I would guess in some way. And so it's really a double hit there.
Mm-hmm.
So she loses the marriage for whatever reason, and then she is essentially abandoned by those who should have been there to help her through this difficult time. So it's only through getting to an emotional space where she's going to be able to be vulnerable again.
And I think a really great place to start could be online support groups or
That's a great idea.
yes, some sort of support group. And you can find a support group for anything online these days. And so find a support group where other people have lost a child because they're really going to get it. And they're not going to judge you for still feeling these grief and this emotion 5 years later because they're probably feeling it and maybe it's been even longer. And so I think that can be a really great way to start rebuilding that trust is to find people where you're not going to have to worry about feeling judged because they're in the same boat. That can be a really great way to start that process of letting people back in.
No, you're absolutely right about that. And I think the group process is actually really, really effective. And for a lot of issues, it's more effective than individual counseling. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that this might be one of those situations where she'd benefit from a group. Now, what I know about groups, I used to run groups. I don't anymore. But what is really important is that you find one that you feel comfortable in.
Mm-hmm.
Which is actually the same thing you want to do with the therapist. The most important thing is that you want to feel comfortable with the therapist. And so that's true with a group, whether it's an in-person group or an online group. And there are going to be enough online groups out there that if she gets into one and it doesn't feel right, don't stay.
Mm-hmm.
Go find another group. Don't give up either. I think that
Yeah.
would be a mistake. And so I think that suggestion of finding an online group is really, really a good one. I think another thing that she can do, and she may have already done this, but I'll mention this for other listeners, is, the death of a child takes away a lot. It creates this huge hole
Mm-hmm.
in the meaning that we find in life. Right. And I would guess you and I are about the same. I find great meaning in being a parent and being a
Yeah.
grandparent.
Oh, yeah.
And so if that is taken away from you, then there's this huge hole created in your worldview and, the meaning you get from being alive. And so one of the things you have to look at is how do you find new meaning in life? How do you create that? Where do you look for that? And there are a lot of opportunities. It can be in service to others. You can find a new passion, somewhere to find meaning, which is going to be different for every person.
Right.
And she may have thought of that. And it's really, really tough to do that when you're feeling the grief so profoundly.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's important to start that process.
Yeah, because there's a huge void in your life, and not that you want to replace your son. Certainly not. But if you can try to help fill that void, and I don't think you could ever completely fill it, but you can certainly do things to help cope, whatever that may be. I've heard great things about a service animal of some sort, to help fill that void a little bit. So this leads us fairly well into our next topic that we want to get into, which is along the lines of Tammy. It fits in with this idea of profound grief that we're talking about. So last week I shared with you guys that my father-in-law moved in with us because he lost his wife about 6 months ago, and he lost her to COVID. And I kind of went into that, and then after that, he lost his job and he got really depressed because he was by himself and he had this really big void to fill because she got really sick at the end to the point where she lost her eyesight. She's able to regain some of it, but I mean, she completely lost her eyesight in one eye and she was very hindered in her other. And another thing that made it really hard that he shared about in his story of grief is when she got COVID and she got really, really sick from it, she started crying out for help. And, she would just be saying, help me. And he'd go in there and say, well, what do you need? And he couldn't do anything. And he felt extremely helpless. And so finally it got to the point where he said, you have to go to the hospital. I can't help you anymore. You have to go. And when she went to the hospital, she said on the way there, I'm not coming home. And,
That's
and
so
he's,
awful.
yeah. And he initially said, oh, don't talk like that. No, don't do that. But then it happened. She didn't come home. And the other really hard thing that I think this isn't something that a ton of people maybe go through, but I'm sure it happens and it can be very, very hard to deal with, is he had to make her medical decisions because it came to a point where they said, she's not showing any signs of brain activity. What do you want to do? We don't know if she's ever going to come back. And now one small mercy in this situation is that her organs started shutting down. And so the doctor was able to say, okay, she's gone and her body is slowly shutting down. It's time to pull the plug. But I mean, that's a very hard decision to make because I mean, the doctor is sitting here saying, do you want to end this person's life? They're not going to have any meaningful recovery. They're never going to regain function, but you still are making that decision to essentially end their life. That can be very hard to cope
Yeah,
with
it,
emotionally.
it can be. And I think that it's really important that everybody have end of life directives. And
Yes.
so, Lindy and I have that. And so the kids know where they are. And that way it takes some of the burden
Mm-hmm.
away from making those decisions because you've got this directive in front of you that essentially says, what you're to do. Very difficult situation for your father-in-law. And
Yeah.
I'm certainly not a Freudian, but Freud said, all we have in life are two things. We have our relationships and we have our work.
Mm-hmm.
And your father-in-law lost both of them
Yep.
very close together. And so that is certainly something that would lead to profound grief and profound depression as well,
Mm-hmm.
because both things he had no control over. And
Yeah.
as I've said, many times before on this podcast, the common theme I see in depression is the sense that either all or part of our life is out of our control. And that's what
Mm-hmm.
he was experiencing. And so the key is, how do you get back into controlling that life? And boy, the role of having to make those decisions, if his wife did not have an end of life directive, that would be
Mm-hmm.
very, very tough. That's a tough position to be put in. So I'm going
Yeah.
to put you on the spot. Do you have
Mm-hmm.
your end of life directive?
We do. Yeah.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Excellent. That's
Yeah.
because I would guess a lot of people your age don't. I'm going to ask my kids. I would bet that my children don't. I'm going to get them to do that.
Yeah. Anyone listening, do it. Even if you don't go through legal means to do it.
Oh, you can write it out.
Yeah.
Sure.
You can write it up and that counts. Like write it up and sign it. I mean, ideally you would have it notarized so it's legally binding, but that's going to be so helpful for your family if something happens. And chances
That's
are it's not going to, but if it does, everyone's going to be really grateful that you did that.
right. And ours is on file with Lindy and I share the same physician
Mm-hmm.
and our internist. And so he has a copy of that.
Yeah.
of our end of life directives.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're listening to this, go do that like now.
Yeah, because what you're doing is it's really about helping those who are going to be left behind.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so you're thinking about those that you would leave behind. But for your father-in-law, I think that is again a double loss, a
Mm-hmm.
different double loss than
Yeah.
Tammy's. But those double losses are really, really tough to get over. And I think what's, at least, as I've heard your story, what's fortunate for your father-in-law is that he's got pretty good support, it seems like. And,
Yes.
because there he is, he's with you. If I were in that position and had those losses, I can't imagine a better place than being with a child and grandchildren. I just think that would be great.
And he's been with us for a couple of weeks now because we recorded well in advance. And when I asked him about talking about this on our podcast, he said that's been very helpful. He said being here and being with people and spending time with his grandkids and being involved in their lives has been wonderful for him. It's helped more than anything has. And I think something that people who experience grief, I think something that they often deal with is families saying they try to give you a timeline of what your grief
Right.
should be. And that's
Yeah.
really unhelpful. You can't create someone's timeline for them. Grief is individual and it
Mhm.
has to happen on their own time. And saying, well, just get over it or just move on is incredibly insensitive and unhelpful.
That's true. And so with Tammy, certainly 5 years is a long time, and she probably would like it to be less intense than it is. And I think, as we've said before, she'll always feel the sadness, but the goal would be for it to be less intense over time, and that it might be less frequent, that it occupies her thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
So both types of grief are really, really tough. And if you think about the difference in, or how it's been for your father-in-law, is he's got this other meaning now, right?
Yes.
He's with,
Mm-hmm.
and I think grandchildren can provide a profound sense of meaning
Yeah.
for us as we age.
Yeah. And I mentioned this last week. He was waiting on her hand and foot because she had all these medical issues and he did a lot. He put a lot of time and effort into taking care of her because he loved her and he made this commitment to her. And I think another important thing to mention that, and this is kind of can be a positive thing in the grieving process, is they've been married for 34 years and they had a lot of ups and downs in their marriage. And one thing that really helped him was before she got really sick with COVID, they were able to reconcile and forgive for all past occurrences. And that is incredibly helpful to be able to do before a death happens.
And you're right. So he had certainly an amount of closure, and a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
don't,
Yeah.
especially in the case of sudden death. There are things we wish we would have said or things we wish we would have done. Well, don't put it off. Just
Yep.
say those things, do those things, because it's true. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. So before we wrap up, I think it would be helpful to talk about a few things that we can do to help someone who is grieving, something that would be helpful. And I think one of the first things is to acknowledge that nothing you say or do is going to fix it. You can
Right.
be there, but you're not going to be able to stop the grief. Don't try to stop the grief. Just be there.
And I think the question that we ought to be asking those people that were around who might be grieving is, say, what can I do to help? What would have meaning to you?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that it's going to be different, just as how we experience grief is different. The things we need from those people around us, those are going to be different for every
Yeah.
person. And so I think asking the question, what would be helpful for you
Yeah.
at this time? And I think the hardest thing for people to do is to sit and listen. And
Yeah.
that seems to be what happened with Tammy as well, that the people around her were unable to be there to listen to her
Mm-hmm.
grief. And for people wanting to know what to do, I think that's what you said is so important. You can't take it away. You can't make it okay. So
Mm-hmm.
don't say things in an effort to make the other person feel good. You can't.
Yeah.
Don't
Yep.
don't do that. Listen Be there, say, let's go on a walk. Get the person out of the house, get the person doing something else. So you become a companion. You become someone they can call if they're struggling.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I think we can do.
And even if they don't want to talk,
Just be there.
Just be there. Yeah. And also respect if they do need space. If they say, I just need to be alone right now, then say, okay, when you're ready to be around people again, call me and I'll come over. And you can even tell them, we don't have to talk. I can just sit there and I can be there with you. If you want to just sit and watch a movie, we can do that. Or if you want to talk, then you can just listen. And if they want to talk about this person that they're grieving, then let them. If they want to talk about something else, then talk about something else. And it's going to be different for everyone. Some people, when they feel grief, they don't want to talk about it with everyone. Whereas I'm the type of person, when I've dealt with a loss, it was helpful for me to talk about it. And I've certainly heard that in people who have lost a child, that it's helpful when people bring it up and it helps them to talk about that child once they're ready, you know? And so it's going to be individualistic to everyone. Just roll with it. Whatever they want to do, just go with it.
And I do think you have to be careful, though, and careful in this. And so it's easy for people to want to isolate. And so you may have to reach out often, and you may even have to show up. So you give them the space,
Yeah.
but you have to be careful not to let them retreat into that space too deeply.
That's a good point.
It becomes way too easy to isolate and not see anyone, which is not good. So having space sometimes is that is really helpful. Being isolated all the time is not helpful at all.
Yeah. Okay. So next week we are going to get into the 7 habits of highly effective people. And I think it's going to be a good topic, and we will see you all then.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.